Yep,
Everything
looks good.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about environmental impact analysis. First, before I begin, I want to recognize that I live and work on the indigenous lands of the Dena'ina people. This afternoon, we're going to talk about permitting. We're going to start out small with the smaller culvert projects, and then we're going to talk about the state and local permitting. And then we're going to finish off the entire afternoon with Greg and Bob on Corps of Engineers permits and how my agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, engages as a technical reviewer on multiple mandates under the Fish and Wildlife Service. So an overview for just my portion of the presentation, we're going to do individual stream crossings, upgrades and replacements, and then what kind of common laws are we working under? So we're working under the National Historic Preservation Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. I'll also mention some other laws that are important when you're doing project planning, and they're going to be more specific to your timing and require a bit of communication on the ground. That's eagles and migratory birds, and then for larger development projects, they require a little bit more coordination as well. So most of us use like checklists to just check the boxes on all this stuff. And I'm hoping to bring to you that it's more than checking boxes. I mean, we can all relate to eventually we want to have some type of sustainable environment. So let's see if we can bring it to that towards the end of this presentation. And let me turn this off that's blocking the screen. There we go. So if a project has a federal connection, you're going to have some type of federal agency communication or a project officer. That project officer is going to be looking for all of the things that I'll be talking about today. So whether or not you have a federal project depends on the federal action and sometimes on the land ownership, like BLM, Forest Service, or the Park Service, or permits like Corps of Engineer permits or federal highway permits. And it also can depend on funding. Like a lot of the projects that Fish and Wildlife Service does with culverts involve funding. In this talk, again, I'm going to stay away from which types of projects need which specific permits or what type of analysis. And instead, I'm just going to focus on the broader issues associated with stream crossings. So let's start out with one that we all have to do if we work for the federal government. It relates to actions that may cause an effect on historic or cultural property. Section 106 applies to any undertaking, project, or activity permitted or funded by a federal agency. And when it's reviewed, you could find it has no potential to cause effects, or you could find that there is potential to cause effects on historic or cultural property. Some culverts, historic culverts, as you see in the picture in the middle, have never had a Section 106 consultation. It's important that you contact your regional historic preservation officer. Each federal agency has a preservation officer. Ours at the Fish and Wildlife Service, I talked to him before the presentation and he said he is willing to review all of the Fish and Wildlife Service culvert projects for us here in Alaska. That's Jeremy Karchett. He just needs a project description, a map or GIS file, and he wants to make sure you include any surrounding areas of disturbance, like your staging areas. And what the project officer will do is he'll review the site-specific characteristics. He'll determine the probability of any kind of historic or cultural significance, and he'll consult the SHPO database. And it's really important to note that this Historic Preservation Act review is different and separate than your NEPA, and it's why we put it up front in the presentation. Another one that's separate is going to be the Endangered Species Act. Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act relates to interagency consultation. This means when a federal agency has an action, they will review their project and consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service if their project may affect fish or wildlife. So Fish and Wildlife Service has a mapping tool. I've listed the website here. Luckily, most of our species are coastal species, so you're not going to run into overlap with their range for most of them. Since I kind of like fish and wildlife and work with endangered species, I wanted to share some of the pictures with you. So please just humor me. In the top, you'll see a spectacled eider. That's a threatened species. In the center on the left is a Steller's eider, and he's mostly in waters down around the Aleutian Islands, although he does nest in north of Alaska. You'll see sea otters in the middle on the right, and there is a distinct population listed here in Alaskan waters. And on the bottom, our only interior species is the introduced wood bison. It still is an endangered or a threatened and endangered species, so you still have to consult on it. And then let's look at when you would consult. So you would go to our mapping tool here, and in the mapping tool, you can do a polygon, a line, or a point, and find out if your project is even within the range of listed species. So if it's in the range of listed species, you as the project officer look at what is my action, what kind of activities are taking place, and what effects might I have on that species or its habitat. So if you don't have any species within your action area, you're certainly going to have no effect. They aren't there. Or if your project doesn't have the type of activities that would affect those types of species or its critical habitat, then you can make that no effect determination and you just put a note to your file. On the other hand, if your project may affect, even if it has downstream effects into a water body where the species occurs or there's critical habitat, then you really want to take a second look at this and look at your activities and whether or not they may affect species. They may not likely to adversely affect those species, or in the third case here, they may likely adversely affect the species. If you make the determination of may affect, whether it's likely or not likely, you consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So that starts our consultation process. Okay, let's leave this one and go to the next. The National Environmental Protection Act. A lot of people think of it as like an umbrella for the environmental laws, because once you get into doing your higher level analysis, you start looking at all of those other laws anyhow. The National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA, states that you have to follow all federal and state laws. So you have to be in compliance with all of those. But how would you do that for a stream crossing? So the basic steps for an environmental review are on the left, and they lead you to the type of environmental analysis that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to look at the entire area of your disturbance, the culvert, any staging areas, anything else you might be doing on the environment. And then you're going to review the existing resources in that area, not just the threatened and endangered species, but all of the existing resources. And you're going to ask yourself, you're going to do some analysis, are the impacts from the action or any associated activities, the construction, the operation, or the revegetation going to have some type of significant impact or an impact on the environment? And then consider the alternative methods to do that. What could you do to avoid or minimize those effects on the resources? So once you do all of this, you can go over to the right-hand side and say, all right, what would my level of environmental analysis be? All federal agencies have categorical exclusions, and a categorical exclusion is a set of actions that don't individually or cumulatively have a significant impact on the environment. As a project officer, you will look through and see if one or more categorical exclusions apply to your project. If so, you would put that rationale in your file and you've done your categorical exclusion. I don't want to speak for every federal agency because everybody's different. So please take that into account. I'm trying to be as general as I can. So excuse me if I step on any other agency's toes. Next, if you look into your project and you think there is an effect on the environment, you might want to do an environmental assessment, which is an EA. Now, if you think there's going to be significant effects on the environment, you could skip the EA and just go straight to an EIS. But then you're talking about some really big level projects, which I don't foresee in normal small culvert replacements. So that finishes that part. Let's talk about some site-specific considerations. These often are going to depend on the resources in the action area and your timing to do those actions. The first one is all about bald and golden eagles. So how do you figure out if you have an eagle issue? Well, for these smaller projects, you can go out and look up and see if there's any eagle's nests. So if there's an eagle's nest within 660 feet of your project, you'll want to go to the website I've provided, and it'll tell you whether or not you need a permit. You could avoid the eagle nesting season, and as long as you are not disturbing the actual nest structure, you could do your activities outside the nesting season if your project is that close to an eagle's nest. Next, to avoid migratory birds, migratory birds nest in general. I mean, there's more specifics depending on the exact location, but in general, May to July. So from May to July, if you can reduce the project footprint and avoid clearing vegetation during the nesting season, it will help migratory birds. We've provided exact nesting seasons in the website that I've provided, and it depends on the type of system that you're in and the location in Alaska for the exact dates. And then I just wanted to mention some other laws that do usually have a connection to culverts and water modifications. That's the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act and the Clean Water Act, Section 404. But like I said, a presentation later this afternoon is going to get into those two in more detail. So I'm going to say thank you.